A single clue can change everything. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The frost had settled thick on the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead that December morning, transforming the familiar lanes into something crystalline and strange. Miss Jane Marple, making her careful way along the high street toward the post office, paused to observe the unusual bustle of activity surrounding the village hall. A small crowd had gathered, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter air as they engaged in the sort of heated discussion that typically preceded either a parish council meeting or a minor revolution. At the center of the commotion stood Councillor Harold Pembroke, Member of Parliament for the constituency, his expensive overcoat a stark contrast to the practical tweeds and woolens worn by the villagers surrounding him. He was a man of middle years who had acquired the particular softness that comes from too many committee dinners and not enough honest labor. His voice, carrying clearly across the frosty air, held that tone of patient condescension that politicians reserve for those they consider their intellectual inferiors. "Progress cannot be halted by sentiment," he was saying, gesturing toward a sheaf of papers in his gloved hand. "The bypass will bring prosperity to this community, and the sale of the common land will fund essential improvements to our infrastructure." Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between progress and profit, noticed several interesting details as she drew closer. Young Mrs. Fletcher, whose family farm lay directly in the path of the proposed development, stood with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face pale with something stronger than cold. Dr. Hedge, usually the most diplomatic of men, wore an expression of barely contained disgust. Most telling of all was the way Councillor Pembroke's own secretary, Miss Patricia Yates, remained several steps removed from her employer, her usually impeccable composure showing hairline cracks of strain. "Begging your pardon, sir," interrupted Tom Fletcher, his farmer's hands clenched at his sides, "but that common land has belonged to this village for 300 years. My grandfather played there as a boy, and his grandfather before him. You can't just sell off history to the highest bidder." Pembroke's smile never wavered, though Miss Marple caught the brief tightening around his eyes that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Fletcher, I understand your attachment to the past, but we must think of the future. The development company has made a very generous offer, and the council has voted to accept." "By one vote," snapped Mrs. Bantry, who had emerged from the post office with her usual directness. "Your vote, as it happens." "Rather convenient, wouldn't you say?" The crowd murmured agreement, and Miss Marple observed how quickly the politician's genial mask began to slip. There was something almost desperate in the way he clutched those papers, as if they contained more than mere planning, documents. She had seen that particular grip before, in the hands of people who knew they were holding their last hope. "The meeting is concluded," Pembroke announced abruptly, folding the papers and thrusting them into his coat pocket. "Good day to you all." He strode away toward his motor car, a gleaming black Rover that looked absurdly out of place among the bicycles and modest vehicles of the villagers. Miss Yates hurried after him, her heels clicking sharply on the frozen ground. Miss Marple noticed how the young woman's shoulders were set with the rigid control of someone fighting back tears or fury, possibly both. The crowd began to disperse, but the anger remained, hanging in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Miss Marple made her purchases with her usual quiet efficiency, listening to the fragments of conversation that swirled around her. Words like corruption and justice were spoken in voices that trembled with more than cold. It was nearly noon when young Timothy Prout came racing down the high street, his bicycle weaving dangerously on the icy road. He skidded to a halt outside the post office, his face flushed with excitement and something darker. "It's Councillor Pembroke," he gasped, drawing a crowd with the magnetic power of disaster. "Found him on Winter Road, they did. Stone dead, with his head bashed in." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering crowd, noticed how few faces showed genuine surprise. In her long experience, she had learned that when a man makes as many enemies as Harold Pembroke had managed in his brief political career, his sudden death tends to inspire more speculation than sorrow. Winter Road, she reflected, was a curious place for a politician to meet his end. The narrow lane led nowhere of particular importance, winding past abandoned cottages before disappearing into the woods. What business could have drawn Harold Pembroke to such a desolate spot on a morning when sensible people stayed close to their fires? The questions multiplied like frost patterns on a window, each one more intricate than the last. The silence that followed Timothy's breathless announcement stretched like a taut wire before snapping under the weight of collective shock. Then, as if a dam had burst, voices erupted in a torrent of exclamation and speculation. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let drama pass unremarked, declared with characteristic directness, "I always said that man would come to grief. Mark my words, there's more to this business than meets the eye." Dr. Hedge appeared at the post office door, his medical bag in hand and his face wearing the carefully neutral expression physicians adopt when they have witnessed something unpleasant. Miss Marple observed how he avoided direct eye contact with the assembled villagers, a sure sign that the details of Pembroke's death were more disturbing than young Timothy's announcement had suggested. Within minutes, the familiar sound of motor-car engines announced the arrival of authority. Inspector Slack emerged from the police vehicle with his usual air of harried efficiency, followed by a constable whose youth and pallor suggested this might be his first encounter with violent death. Slack surveyed the gathered crowd with the weary resignation of a man who knew that village curiosity would complicate his investigation considerably. "Right then," Slack announced, positioning himself in the center of the group with practiced authority. "I'll need statements from everyone who was present at this morning's council meeting, and I want to know who saw Councillor Pembroke after it ended." Evans the postman, still shaken from his grim discovery, stammered through his account. "I were doing the second round, taking the bottom cottages first on account of the ice. Cut along Winter Road to save time and saw what I thought were a sack in the ditch. Weren't no sack, though." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Head bashed in something dreadful, it were." Mr. Pierce from the development company stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to dealing with authorities. "I was walking toward the common to examine boundary markers when I encountered Evans in considerable distress. Naturally, I assisted in summoning help." His explanation was delivered with practiced ease, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands moved restlessly, adjusting his cuff with deliberate precision. "Had you an appointment with Mr. Pembroke this morning?" Slack inquired, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Not today, Inspector. Our business was conducted through proper council channels. I had no expectation of encountering him on such a remote lane." Dr. Hedge, returning from his preliminary examination, provided crucial details that sharpened the timeline considerably. "Very recent death, Inspector. The body was still warm when I examined it. I'd estimate no more than an hour, possibly less. There's a significant head wound, but I'll need to examine him properly to determine the exact cause." "Weapon?" Slack demanded. "Not at the scene," Haydock replied grimly. Miss Marple, positioned unobtrusively at the edge of the gathering, absorbed these details while her knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm. The timeline was revealing. If Pembroke had died around 10:30, he must have proceeded directly from the contentious village meeting to Winter Road. Such urgency suggested either a prearranged appointment or some compelling reason that had drawn him to that desolate spot. "I saw him after the meeting," offered Mr. Hawes, the verger, his voice carrying an odd note of reluctance. "Walking past the Lion toward the Oakbridge Road. He was with someone, a lady in a red scarf." Slack's attention sharpened immediately. "Can you identify this lady?" Hawes shifted uncomfortably, his eyes sliding away from the inspector's direct gaze. It was some distance, and the light weren't good, Just saw the red scarf, really." Miss Marple filed away this detail with interest. In her experience, people who claimed to see only scarves usually saw considerably more than they felt comfortable admitting. Miss Patricia Yates, who had remained silent throughout the questioning, finally spoke when Slack turned his attention to her. "Mr. Pembroke often walked to clear his head after difficult meetings," she said, her voice steady but brittle. "He found it helped him think through complex problems." As she spoke, Miss Marple noticed the young woman's gloves, fine suede in an oatmeal shade, with a distinctive smear of bright green paint on the right one. It was precisely the aggressive, hopeful green of the development company's hoardings that had appeared overnight at the common's edge, proclaiming future prosperity in bold letters. The inspector's methodical questioning revealed the extent of Pembroke's unpopularity. Tom Fletcher's heated exchange that morning was common knowledge, as was the narrow council vote that had sealed the common's fate. Mrs. Fletcher stood pale and silent beside her husband, her earlier composure replaced by something approaching fear. "We asked him to listen," she said finally, her voice carrying an intensity that silenced the murmuring crowd. "He wouldn't hear reason." As the formal questioning concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. Winter Road was indeed a curious destination for a man seeking to clear his head. Unless, of course, his head had been cluttered with secrets that required the privacy only such a desolate location could provide. In her long experience, she had learned that when ambitious men chose lonely places for their final walks, they rarely went there by accident. The green paint on Miss Yates' glove lingered in her thoughts like a persistent melody, waiting to reveal its significance in the larger composition of murder and motive that was only beginning to unfold. The dispersing crowd left behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusations and the particular tension that follows violent death in a small community. Miss Marple, observing the subtle choreography of departure, noted how certain individuals avoided each other's eyes, while others lingered with the purposeful casualness of those hoping to overhear revealing fragments. The art of village information gathering, she reflected, was never more refined than in the immediate aftermath of scandal. Mrs. Bantry, displaying her characteristic inability to let sleeping dogs lie, approached with the determined stride of someone who had reached definitive conclusions. "Jane, you mark my words. This business has been brewing for weeks. That man had more enemies than a tax collector, and twice as many secrets." Miss Marple's needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this observation. In her experience, violent death rarely struck without warning signs, though those signs were often visible only in retrospect. "Indeed, Dolly, though I confess I'm rather puzzled by his choice of destination. Winter Road seems an unlikely spot for a morning constitutional." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Hedge, who approached with the careful discretion of a man bearing unpleasant professional details. "Curious thing," he murmured, lowering his voice. "The wound suggests he was struck from behind, but there are defensive marks on his hands. He saw it coming, at least partially." This revelation cast the morning's events in a different light entirely. A surprise attack from behind suggested premeditation, while defensive wounds implied confrontation and struggle. The contradiction troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind, which preferred murders to follow logical patterns rather than present contradictory evidence. Miss Patricia Yates approached them with obvious reluctance, clutching a leather portfolio against her chest. Her earlier composure had given way to something approaching panic, and the green paint stain on her glove seemed more pronounced, as if anxiety had made her careless with her movements. "Miss Marple?" she began, her voice carrying the desperate politeness of someone seeking an ally. "You knew Mr. Pembroke from the parish council meetings, didn't you? He wasn't a bad man, you know. People say terrible things, but he was trying to do what he thought best for the village." The defense trailed off unconvincingly, and Miss Marple observed how the young woman's eyes kept drifting toward the portfolio she held. Whatever documents it contained clearly weighed more heavily on her mind than proper eulogies for her deceased employer. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I'm sure he had the village's interests at heart, though I notice you've had some difficulty with paint this morning. Such a distinctive green, rather like the development company's hoardings." Miss Yates's hand moved instinctively to cover the stain. "I stopped to read the notice last night. The paint was still fresh." "In the dark? How industrious of you." "I'd mislaid my purse," came the hurried explanation. "I thought I might have dropped it there." Miss Marple, who heard the small, strained falsity in that response as clearly as a bell, merely nodded sympathetically. In her experience, people who invented explanations for paint stains usually had more significant matters to conceal. Later that afternoon, when Mrs. Bantry suggested they drive out to Winter Road before the threatened snow began in earnest, Miss Marple readily agreed. The lane appeared much as it always did, narrow, secretive, bordered with bramble and the broken backs of abandoned cottages. But there was a disordered feeling about it now, as if the place remembered violence. The constable on duty was easily dispatched with Mrs. Bantry's promise of an errand involving hot soup, and they were left to examine the scene in relative privacy. The ditch where Evans had discovered the body ran shallow alongside the lane, its frozen weeds snapped by the morning's commotion. Miss Marple stood very still, her gaze traveling from the flattened reed beds to a gap in the hedge where the wire had been pressed almost smooth. "Someone came and went privately," observed Mrs. Bantry. "Through there, I should think." "Because someone did not wish to be seen," Miss Marple agreed, her attention caught by a small length of red wool snagged on a thorn. It hung parted neatly, as if pulled free rather than torn, though red is a curious color for privacy. Near the ditch, a large flat stone showed signs of recent disturbance, its surface flecked with what might have been chalk or frost, or something else entirely. Miss Marple did not examine it closely. Such things belonged to the police. Yet she filed away the detail, remembering that people who chose weapons in haste often revealed themselves through their selections. As they returned to the village, Miss Marple reflected that Harold Pembroke's death had already illuminated more about the hidden currents of St. Mary Mead than months of ordinary observation might have accomplished. The green paint on Miss Yates's glove, the red wool in the hedge, the defensive wounds that spoke of confrontation rather than ambush. Each detail added another thread to an increasingly complex tapestry. Murder, she had long observed, possessed a remarkable ability to reveal the secret chambers of human nature, though it often took considerable patience to understand what those revelations truly meant. The snow that had begun as tentative flakes during Miss Marple's afternoon expedition to Winter Road fell with increasing determination as evening approached, transforming St. Mary Mead into something both beautiful and ominous. By the time the lamps were lit along the high street, the entire village knew that Tom Fletcher had been taken to the police station for questioning, and the collective mood had shifted from shocked curiosity to grim satisfaction. There was comfort, Miss Marple reflected, in having a clear target for one's fears and suspicions. Inspector Slack's investigation had proceeded with characteristic efficiency throughout the afternoon. The case appeared refreshingly straightforward. A hot-tempered farmer with everything to lose, a public quarrel witnessed by half the village, and an opportunity that aligned perfectly with the estimated time of death. Tom Fletcher's alibi, mending fence alone on the far side of his property, was precisely the sort of convenient isolation that guilty men often claimed. Mrs. Fletcher stood at her cottage gate as Miss Marple passed on her way home, her face bearing the particular strain of a woman whose world had shifted beneath her feet. Her hands, Miss Marple noted with interest, showed fresh scratches that could have come from brambles or barbed wire, though they might equally have resulted from moving frightened livestock in hasty circumstances. "They've taken Tom," Mrs. Fletcher said without preamble, her voice carrying that flat despair of someone who had expected disaster, yet found it no less devastating. Inspector Slack says the motive is clear enough, and Tom's temper this morning sealed it. Miss Marple approached the gate with gentle deliberation. I'm sure the inspector is simply being thorough, my dear. These matters have a way of revealing their true nature given time. Do they? The younger woman's laugh held no humor. Tom was with me all morning after that dreadful meeting, helping move our sheep to the upper pasture. We'd found our old ram, Blackie, had gotten through the fence somehow, wandering down near Winter Road of all places. The poor creature was acting strange and skittish, almost like he'd witnessed something that frightened him. This detail struck Miss Marple as potentially significant. In her experience, animals possessed an uncanny ability to witness human drama without the complications of loyalty or self-interest that clouded human testimony. A frightened ram near the scene of murder might prove more reliable than carefully rehearsed alibis. Before she could pursue this observation, the sound of an approaching motor car drew their attention. Mr. Pierce from the development company emerged from his sleek vehicle with obvious reluctance, his earlier smooth confidence replaced by something approaching agitation. His expensive shoes, Miss Marple noted, bore traces of the distinctive red clay found only in certain parts of Winter Road. Curious for a man who claimed to have encountered the scene purely by chance. Mrs. Fletcher, Pierce began awkwardly, I wanted to express my sympathies about your husband's situation. I'm certain this unfortunate matter will be resolved quickly. Are you indeed? Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried a bitter edge. And I suppose that makes things tidier for your development plans, doesn't it? Pierce's face flushed with what might have been genuine indignation, though his hands remained firmly thrust into his coat pockets. That's hardly fair, Mrs. Fletcher. Whatever happened to Councillor Pembroke has nothing to do with legitimate business interests. Miss Marple observed this exchange with careful attention, noting how Pierce's rehearsed responses suggested someone who had anticipated these questions. When he mentioned seeing a figure in red during his morning walk, his delivery carried that particular tone of someone reciting a carefully prepared story, rather than recalling spontaneous memory. As Pierce departed with obvious relief, Mrs. Fletcher turned to Miss Marple with renewed desperation. He's lying about something, isn't he? You can sense it, too. People often shade the truth when they're frightened, Miss Marple replied diplomatically. The question becomes what, precisely, they fear revealing. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat with her knitting before the fire, she reflected on the day's accumulating inconsistencies. Tom Fletcher's boots had shown the dark, rich loam of Oakfield, rather than Winter Road's characteristic pale clay. The red wool caught in the hedge bore little resemblance to Mrs. Fletcher's practical scarf. Miss Yates' green-stained glove and her curious request for directions to Winter Road suggested knowledge she had not admitted. Most telling of all were the defensive wounds Dr. Haydock had described, evidence of confrontation rather than the surprise attack one might expect from a farmer's rage. The snow continued its steady descent, muffling the village's familiar sounds and creating that hushed intimacy which encouraged confidences and revealed secrets. Miss Marple's needles maintained their gentle rhythm as a small, persistent notion began to take shape in her mind. Inspector Slack would be content with his obvious solution, but she had lived long enough to know that murders born of public quarrels rarely required such elaborate staging or chose such isolated venues for their resolution. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead settled into its deceptive winter peace, but beneath that pristine surface, Miss Marple sensed the deeper currents of deception still flowing toward their inevitable revelation. Morning brought crystalline clarity to the snow-covered village, though Miss Marple found that the same could not be said for the circumstances surrounding Harold Pembroke's death. Her customary walk to the post office revealed a community transformed not merely by weather but by the subtle realignments that follow violent death. Conversations ceased abruptly when she approached, then resumed in hushed tones that suggested the participants were less concerned with Tom Fletcher's guilt than with their own potential exposure to scrutiny. At the post office, Evans the postman was holding court with nervous energy, his account of discovering Pembroke's body growing more elaborate with each retelling. Yet buried within his theatrical embellishments lay observations that struck Miss Marple as genuine. Strangest thing, though, Evans was saying, were the way his coat were buttoned wrong, all askew like someone else had done it up in a hurry. And his hat, found it yards away, caught in a bramble bush like it had been thrown. This detail resonated with Miss Marple's growing certainty that Pembroke's death had been hastily arranged rather than carefully planned. Someone had attempted to restore order to a scene that had gone badly wrong, but their efforts had been compromised by panic or inexperience. The wrongly buttoned coat spoke of unfamiliar hands working in desperate haste. Her contemplation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, his expression bearing the satisfaction of a man who believed his case was nearing resolution. "Tom Fletcher remains in custody," he announced with professional accomplishment. "Clear case of motive and opportunity, Miss Marple. The man had a heated argument with Pembroke just hours before the murder, and his alibi, mending fence alone, is precisely the sort of convenient isolation guilty men often claim." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this information. "And the defensive wounds, Inspector, do they suggest he was struck from behind, or did he face his attacker?" Slack's momentary pause revealed a flicker of annoyance. "A scuffle, perhaps. These things aren't always neat. We recovered footprints near the scene. Large ones, consistent with work boots. The evidence points clearly to Fletcher." Yet Miss Marple remained troubled by the inconsistencies. She recalled the distinct red clay on Mr. Pierce's expensive shoes, a detail that hardly suggested the hurried, rage-fueled attack of an angry farmer. More significantly, the red wool she had quietly retrieved from the hedge that morning was of finer weave than any practical farming attire would require. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought news that transformed her understanding entirely. "My preliminary examination has revealed something most peculiar," he confided, drawing them into the privacy of his motor car. "The wound pattern shows an initial blow from behind, but it wasn't immediately fatal. There was a second impact from the front, suggesting the victim had turned to face his attacker. Most curious of all, there are traces of limestone dust in the wound, the sort used in building work." This revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light. Limestone dust suggested construction materials, pointing toward the development project rather than agricultural implements. More significantly, the sequence of injuries implied a confrontation that had escalated beyond anyone's initial intentions. Miss Patricia Yates, who had approached during their conversation, grew increasingly pale at Dr. Haydock's explanation. Her portfolio was clutched with the desperate grip of someone whose security depended entirely on its contents, and her usually immaculate appearance showed telling signs of strain. "Miss Marple," she began with forced brightness, "I wonder if you might spare a moment. I'm organizing Mr. Pembroke's papers, and there are certain documents—" Her voice trailed off as she glanced nervously around, clearly uncomfortable with the public setting. They stepped aside, where Miss Yates' carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. "There are things about the development project that weren't discussed publicly," she said, her breath forming urgent clouds in the cold air. "Financial arrangements that Mr. Pembroke felt were necessary, but perhaps not entirely conventional." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "How interesting, my dear. And these arrangements, they concerned the village common, among other things." Miss Yates's grip on her portfolio tightened. There were private agreements, compensation arrangements that went beyond the official council vote. But if they were to become public knowledge, certain reputations would be compromised. The careful phrasing suggested that Harold Pembroke's definition of fairness might not have aligned with conventional interpretations. Miss Marple had encountered enough parish politics to recognize the euphemisms surrounding questionable financial dealings. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence. The limestone dust pointed towards someone connected to the development project itself. The missing papers suggested motives beyond simple anger over land use. The wrongly buttoned coat and displaced hat spoke of someone unfamiliar with dressing a man's body. Most tellingly, the red wool in the hedge, fine quality that split cleanly rather than tearing, suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental snagging. The obvious solution of Tom Fletcher's guilt was beginning to feel like a convenient distraction from darker truths lurking beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface. The morning after her conversation with Miss Yates brought Miss Marple a clarity that had nothing to do with the crystalline air or the way sunlight transformed the snow-covered village into something approaching innocence. She had spent the night considering the accumulating inconsistencies, and dawn had revealed connections that daylight made undeniable. Her first destination was Mrs. Bartlett's lodging house, where a careful observation of the washing line visible through the front window confirmed what she had begun to suspect. A red scarf hung there, fine wool of excellent quality, with a small section of fringe that had been carefully knotted where a strand had pulled free. Miss Marple, who had spent decades mending the consequences of careless handling, recognized the particular neat repair that suggested both haste and familiarity with needlework. The red wool she had retrieved from Winter Road's hedge would, she was certain, match this scarf precisely, not in the rough tearing one might expect from desperate flight, but in the clean separation of a deliberate placement. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hedge, whose expression carried the particular gravity of a man bearing news that would reshape their understanding entirely. "Most curious development," he murmured, drawing her into the privacy of his motor car. "The limestone dust in Pembroke's wound, I've had it analyzed. It's not common building lime at all, but a specialized grade used in expensive construction work. Rather costly stuff, actually, and not readily available in agricultural communities." This revelation transformed the weapon from an implement of passion into something altogether more calculated. Miss Marple reflected that people who carried expensive construction materials to remote lanes were either engaged in very specific building projects or had access to supplies that suggested professional connections rather than agricultural ones. The financial dimensions of the case became clearer through her morning visit to the vicarage, where Reverend Clement provided context that official investigations often overlooked. There were persistent rumors about Pembroke's arrangements, he confided over tea, his clerical discretion warring with pastoral concern. Suggestions that the common sale involved private agreements beyond the official council vote. Shell companies, perhaps, or beneficiaries whose names never appeared in public documents. Mrs. Clement, joining them with the practical insight that came from managing parish finances, added details that crystallized Miss Marple's growing suspicions. "The development notices appeared overnight, you know. Mr. Pierce brought workmen after 11 o'clock, rough men with expensive equipment. But there was another motor car present, one of those long black ones with distinctive fittings. Not Mr. Pierce's usual vehicle at all. These financial irregularities suggested motives that extended far beyond Tom Fletcher's agricultural concerns. Someone had invested considerable effort in arrangements that Pembroke's death had either protected or catastrophically disrupted. Miss Marple's experience with parish politics had taught her that murders involving missing money rarely stemmed from simple passion. Her afternoon encounter with Miss Patricia Yates revealed the extent to which desperation had transformed into something approaching relief. The young woman's earlier panic had given way to a composed efficiency that suggested burdens had been lifted rather than assumed. Her portfolio, previously clutched with white-knuckled desperation, had been replaced by a modest handbag, and her demeanor carried the particular lightness of someone who had successfully navigated dangerous waters. "Such a relief that the investigation is proceeding systematically," Miss Yates remarked with careful brightness. "These matters have a way of revealing their true nature once all the relevant facts emerge." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this curious phrasing. "Indeed, my dear, though I find that facts often arrange themselves in quite unexpected patterns, rather like that interesting green stain on your glove. Such a distinctive shade. The sort one might acquire from fresh paint in poor lighting conditions. Miss Yates' carefully maintained composure flickered momentarily. I'm afraid I don't recall any paint, Miss Marple. The denial confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. People who forgot paint stains usually remembered them quite vividly, along with the circumstances that had necessitated careful concealment. The green paint connected Miss Yates to the development company's nocturnal activities in ways that her official duties wouldn't explain. Mr. Pierce's afternoon appearance brought urgency that transformed speculation into certainty. His earlier smooth confidence had deteriorated into barely controlled agitation, and his expensive shoes bore traces of the distinctive clay found only in Winter Road's particular geography. Curious for someone whose involvement had supposedly been limited to discovering Evans in distress. The revised documentation must be processed immediately, he informed Miss Yates with strained authority. Pembroke was supposed to sign the final agreements yesterday afternoon. Without his authorization, the entire arrangement could collapse. Miss Marple observed how this conversation revealed layers of complexity that simple land development wouldn't require. The revised documentation suggested changes significant enough to demand personal meetings in remote locations, while Pierce's desperation indicated stakes that extended far beyond professional disappointment. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple synthesized the accumulating evidence into patterns that pointed toward motives considerably more sophisticated than agricultural grievance. The expensive limestone dust suggested professional preparation rather than improvised weapons. The financial irregularities indicated corruption that Pembroke's death had either concealed or exposed. Miss Yates' transformation from desperation to relief suggested knowledge of developments that others hadn't shared. Most significantly, the red scarf evidence pointed toward someone whose presence at Winter Road had been both deliberate and carefully concealed. The clean separation of wool fibers suggested placement rather than accident, while the neat repair indicated someone who understood both the evidence's significance and the necessity of maintaining appearances. Standing at her sitting-room window as evening approached, Miss Marple reflected that Harold Pembroke's death had illuminated the hidden currents of corruption that flowed beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface. The obvious solution of Tom Fletcher's guilt was beginning to feel like a convenient distraction from darker truths involving missing money, forged documents, and the sort of desperate measures that people took when their carefully constructed deceptions threatened to collapse. The pattern was becoming clearer, though its final design remained obscured by the careful lies of those who hoped their secrets would remain buried beneath winter's deceptive tranquility. The evening brought a discovery that transformed Miss Marple's understanding of Harold Pembroke's death entirely, though it came not through dramatic revelation, but through the methodical persistence that characterized Inspector Slack at his most thorough. Word reached her through Dr. Haydock, who arrived at her cottage with the particular gravity of a man whose professional obligations had extended into uncomfortable territory. "Most curious development at Pembroke's residence," he reported, settling into her sitting room with obvious weariness. Slack's men were conducting a final search when they discovered a loose brick in the study fireplace. Behind it, a leather-bound ledger that paints our deceased councillor in quite a different light than his public persona suggested. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this information. Hidden ledgers, in her experience, rarely contained the sort of financial arrangements that bore scrutiny, and men who concealed their record-keeping usually had excellent reasons for avoiding conventional banking practices. The ledger's contents, as Dr. Haydock described them, revealed Harold Pembroke as a man deeply embedded in financial arrangements that extended far beyond municipal politics. Shell companies, numbered accounts, and transactions involving sums that dwarfed anything the common sale could justify filled its meticulously kept pages. Most significantly, The final entry bore the date of his death and a notation that crystallized everything Miss Marple had observed. Winter odd, final exchange, red figure. This single line transformed the morning's events from apparent coincidence into calculated appointment. Pembroke had not wandered to Winter Road in anger or contemplation. He had gone there to meet someone specific, for a transaction that his hidden records suggested would be both final and substantial. The red figure confirmed what the fine wool caught in the hedge had already suggested, someone whose presence at the scene had been both deliberate and carefully concealed. Inspector Slack's subsequent visit brought official confirmation of what the ledger had revealed, though his manner suggested professional embarrassment rather than triumph. "We're releasing Tom Fletcher," he announced with obvious reluctance. "The financial evidence suggests motives that extend considerably beyond agricultural disputes. Pembroke was involved in arrangements that make our local land sale appear almost incidental." Miss Marple observed how this admission transformed the inspector's earlier confidence into something approaching bewilderment. The obvious solution had collapsed under the weight of evidence that pointed toward crimes far more sophisticated than rural passion could explain. The expensive limestone dust, the wrongly buttoned coat, the defensive wounds that spoke of confrontation rather than ambush, all these details now aligned with a different narrative entirely. The revelation recontextualized everything she had observed about the case's principal figures. Miss Patricia Yates's transformation from desperation to relief made perfect sense if Pembroke's death had eliminated someone whose knowledge of financial irregularities posed ongoing threats. Her careful euphemisms about administrative matters and her obvious access to specialized information suggested involvement that extended far beyond secretarial duties. Mr. Pierce's behavior, too, took on new significance when viewed through the lens of financial conspiracy. His desperate urgency about revised documentation and his presence at Winter Road despite claiming coincidental discovery suggested someone whose interests in the development project involved considerably more than legitimate business arrangements. The red clay on his expensive shoes indicated familiarity with the murder scene that his official story couldn't explain. Most tellingly, the coded reference to red figure connected directly to the fine wool Miss Marple had retrieved from the hedge. Not the rough tearing of desperate flight, but the clean separation of deliberate placement. Someone had worn that red scarf to the meeting with Pembroke and had taken considerable care to ensure their presence would appear accidental rather than planned. The financial documents revealed the true scope of what Pembroke's death had either protected or catastrophically disrupted. The shell companies and numbered accounts suggested money laundering operations that used the village commons sale as cover for much larger financial movements. Someone had been systematically diverting funds through arrangements that Pembroke's ledger suggested had become increasingly one-sided in his favor. As the implications settled, Miss Marple reflected on how completely the case had transformed from apparent village dispute into sophisticated financial crime. The limestone dust indicated access to specialized materials that connected the murder to the development project itself. The timing of the final exchange suggested that Pembroke's death had interrupted a transaction that someone had desperately needed to complete or prevent. The red scarf evidence remained the most telling detail, pointing towards someone whose presence at both the village meeting and the Winter Road appointment had been carefully orchestrated to appear innocent. The clean wool fibers suggested placement rather than accident, while the careful concealment indicated someone who understood both the evidence's significance and the necessity of maintaining appearances. Standing at her window as evening deepened, Miss Marple contemplated how Harold Pembroke's hidden ledger had illuminated the true currents of corruption flowing beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface. The red figure had emerged from the shadows of financial conspiracy, and the pattern of deception was finally becoming clear. What remained was to determine whether this mysterious figure had been Pembroke's victim, his accomplice, or his executioner in a game where the stakes had proven high enough to justify murder. The gentle rhythms of village life continued outside her window, but Miss Marple knew that beneath that tranquil surface, someone was waiting to see whether their carefully constructed deception would survive the scrutiny that Pembroke's death had inevitably attracted. The morning following Tom Fletcher's release brought a curious transformation to St. Mary Mead's collective consciousness. The village, with the remarkable adaptability that small communities display in times of crisis, quietly adjusted its narrative without admitting error. By noon, the consensus had shifted from Tom's obvious guilt to a more complex understanding that the true villain would, when revealed, prove to be precisely the sort of person they had suspected all along. Though no two villagers could agree on who that person might be. Mr. Pierce's motor car drew narrowed eyes wherever it appeared. Miss Yates' composed demeanor attracted whispers that shifted like the drifting snow, and even poor Evans the postman found himself regarded with an unusual interest that made his hands clumsy and his bag heavier than its contents could justify. Miss Marple, recognizing that a village's scrutiny could prove more unsettling than an inspector's questions, called at the post office under the excellent pretext of purchasing stamps. Evans served her with exaggerated care, twice miscounting and once dropping a book of 6 pennies that scattered across the polished counter with undignified haste. His anxiety, which had seemed like honest shock the day before, now bore the particular burden of someone carrying knowledge too heavy for comfortable shoulders. "Such a difficult time for everyone," Miss Marple observed gently, watching as Evan's composure finally cracked under the weight of his secret. "I can't keep it any longer," he burst out, glancing nervously around the empty shop. "When I found Mr. Pembroke, he weren't quite as he was when the constable came. His coat was open, scarf turned odd, and there was an envelope in his inside pocket. Thick as a Christmas pudding it was. I thought perhaps it contained medical information, so I took it to examine. When I grew frightened, I tried to set his coat right, but I button wrong when I'm flustered. His hat had rolled away, and I tossed it in the hedge without thinking properly." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. "And the envelope, Evans?" With trembling hands, he described not the thing itself, but its contents. A receipt stamped red fig and a small brass key numbered with a tin tag. I hid them under the floorboard by the scales, meaning to hand them over once I'd worked out how to explain. But someone came in the night. The lock wasn't forced. Nothing else was taken, but that plank had been lifted and replaced. I'd not have known except the dust was different. The confession explained the wrongly buttoned coat that had puzzled Miss Marple from the beginning, but it also revealed something far more significant. Someone else had known or guessed where a frightened man might conceal dangerous evidence. Evans's description of his late visitors, Mr. Pierce with contracts requiring registration, Miss Yates with a parcel for Mrs. Bartlett, provided a narrow window of opportunity for someone with the necessary knowledge and access. Young Timothy Prout's breathless arrival brought additional confirmation of nocturnal activities. "Saw a long black motor car by the post office last night," he announced with the importance of youth bearing vital information. 11:30 it was. Gentleman stepped out, tall, carried a walking stick. No proper lamps, just the little side lights like cat's eyes. Stood there a moment, then drove off toward Oakbridge. The description matched perfectly with Mrs. Clement's earlier observation about unfamiliar, expensive vehicles, and it aligned with Dr. Haydick's subsequent news about developments at the county bank. A safety deposit box in Oakbridge had been opened that morning using a key matching Evans's description. The client of record bore the initials P.Y., and the clerk distinctly remembered a red scarf. Miss Marple reflected on how the pieces were finally arranging themselves into a coherent pattern. The red figure from Pembroke's ledger had been someone he trusted enough to meet privately, someone with access to both financial information and construction materials. someone whose presence at Winter Road could be explained by legitimate business concerns. The stolen envelope and key suggested that Pembroke's death had interrupted a transaction of considerable importance, while the midnight theft from Evans's hiding place revealed someone who understood exactly what evidence needed to be recovered. Most significantly, the careful staging of the crime scene, the wrongly buttoned coat, the displaced hat, the deliberate placement of red wool in the hedge, spoke of someone who understood the necessity of directing suspicion elsewhere while concealing their own involvement. The limestone dust that had puzzled Dr. Hedge connected directly to the development project's specialized materials, while the defensive wounds suggested a confrontation that had escalated beyond anyone's original intentions. Standing at her sitting room windows as afternoon light faded over the snow-covered village, Miss Marple contemplated the elegant deception that had nearly succeeded. The obvious red scarf, like a robin on fresh snow, had drawn every observer's attention exactly as intended. But it was the quiet details, the quality of the wool, the nature of the repair work, the careful timing of alibis, that revealed the true architect of Harold Pembroke's death. The pattern was complete now, waiting only for the final confrontation that would bring St. Mary Mead's latest tragedy to its inevitable conclusion. The pattern was complete now, requiring only the gentlest pressure to reveal its final design. Miss Marple, who understood that truth emerged most reliably when people felt secure rather than cornered, arranged her test with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades observing human nature under stress. She invited both Miss Patricia Yates and Mr. Pierce to tea at Mrs. Bantry's that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the church roof fund, but actually to provide the sort of social setting where careful observation could proceed without alarming those who most needed watching. The sitting room at Mead possessed that particular atmosphere of genteel comfort that encouraged confidences while discouraging dramatic scenes. Mrs. Bantry, briefed with characteristic efficiency, had arranged the seating so that afternoon light fell precisely where Miss Marple required it, illuminating both the red wool she had placed casually beside her knitting basket and the careful expressions of her guests as they encountered evidence they had hoped remained hidden. Miss Patricia Yates arrived first, her punctuality bearing the particular strain of someone who had spent considerable effort preparing for an encounter they hoped to navigate successfully. Her appearance showed meticulous attention to detail. Gloves carefully selected to conceal any remaining paint stains, scarf chosen in neutral tones that bore no resemblance to anything incriminating, and her manner carrying that composed efficiency which had replaced her earlier desperation so completely. Mr. Pierce followed shortly after, his earlier smooth confidence now edged with something approaching wariness. His expensive shoes, Miss Marple noted with interest, had been thoroughly cleaned since their last encounter, though traces of Winter Road's distinctive clay remained embedded in the decorative stitching where hasty brushing couldn't reach. "Such a relief that poor Tom Fletcher has been released," Miss Marple observed gently, her knitting needles maintaining their rhythmic click as she watched both guests settle into their chairs. "Though I confess the investigation has revealed such interesting details about our village's hidden complexities. That curious red wool found at Winter Road, for instance. Such fine quality, and it separated so cleanly from the hedge, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately." Miss Yates' carefully maintained composure flickered as her gaze fixed involuntarily on the evidence beside Miss Marple's chair. "I'm sure there are many explanations for such things," she said with practiced lightness, though her voice carried a subtle strain that hadn't been present moments before. "Indeed there are," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though I've been puzzling over the particular characteristics of this strand. The weave suggests expensive manufacture, and there are signs of careful repair work, the sort of neat mending that speaks of someone skilled with needle and thread. Rather like that lovely scarf you wore to the village meeting, my dear. I noticed how expertly you had knotted the fringe where a strand had pulled free." The observation struck its target with surgical precision. Miss Yates' hand moved instinctively toward her throat, a gesture of self-preservation that revealed more than any verbal response might have accomplished. Her breathing grew shallow, and the composed efficiency that had characterized her recent demeanor began to show hairline cracks of strain. Mr. Pierce, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uncomfortable, his earlier wariness transforming into something approaching alarm. When Miss Marple mentioned the limestone dust found in Pembroke's wound, such a specialized grade, the sort used in expensive construction work, his hand moved unconsciously to brush at his coat cuff, where traces of the distinctive pale powder still clung despite his efforts at concealment. "The financial documents have been most illuminating," Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the mounting tension in the room. Poor Mr. Pembroke's hidden ledger revealed such complex arrangements. That final entry particularly caught my attention. Winter Road, final exchange, red figure. One does wonder what circumstances would require such a meeting in so isolated a location. The phrase struck both guests with visible impact, though their reactions differed significantly. Pierce's face flushed with what might have been genuine indignation mixed with fear, while Miss Yates grew pale, her earlier composure giving way to something approaching the desperation she had displayed immediately after Pembroke's death. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, "that it's time we discussed what really happened on Winter Road that morning. You see, my dears, I've learned that when people create elaborate deceptions, they often reveal themselves through the very details they use to misdirect attention. The red scarf was meant to suggest a woman's presence without pointing to anyone specific, wasn't it? But you hadn't anticipated how much the quality of the wool would reveal, or how a frightened postman's well-meaning interference would disrupt your careful staging." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of Mrs. Bantry's mantel clock and the almost inaudible sound of Miss Yates' carefully controlled breathing finally becoming ragged. Miss Marple's test had achieved its purpose, the critical reaction that would transform speculation into certainty, preparing the ground for the final revelation that would bring St. Mary Mead's latest tragedy to its inevitable conclusion. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire, and Miss Marple, setting down her knitting with the deliberate care of someone who had reached an inevitable conclusion, spoke with the gentle authority that had unraveled so many secrets over the years. "You were both there, of course," she said simply, her eyes moving between Miss Patricia Yates and Mr. Pierce with the calm certainty of someone who had watched all the pieces finally arrange themselves into their proper pattern. "Mr. Pembroke, you see, was not merely corrupt. He was systematic about it. His hidden ledger reveals a man who had discovered that information could be far more valuable than money and considerably more dangerous to those who possessed inconvenient secrets. The development project was never really about village improvement, was it? It was about creating a network of shell companies and numbered accounts that could launder money while providing excellent cover for what was essentially a blackmail operation." Miss Yates' carefully maintained composure had finally cracked entirely, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag with the desperate grip of someone whose world was collapsing. Mr. Pierce, meanwhile, had grown very still, the sort of unnatural stillness that comes when a man realizes that all his careful planning has been for nothing. "The red figure notation in his ledger referred to you, Miss Yates," Miss Marple continued gently. "Not because of any romantic entanglement, but because you had become essential to his operations. You handled the paperwork, facilitated the transfers, maintained the files that gave him power over so many people. But recently, Mr. Pembroke had grown greedy, hadn't he? He wanted more than his agreed share, and he had begun to threaten exposure if his demands weren't met. The meeting at Winter Road was arranged by you both, though for different reasons. Miss Yates, you believed you could reason with him, perhaps even buy him off with evidence you had carefully gathered about his methods. Mr. Pierce, you had reached the conclusion that Harold Pembroke had become too dangerous to live. The limestone dust found in his wound came from samples you carry in your motor car. The expensive grade used in your high-end construction projects. You brought it deliberately, didn't you? Not as a negotiating tool, but as a weapon that couldn't be traced to any local source. Mr. Pierce's face had gone ashen, but he remained silent, his earlier smooth confidence replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "You wore that distinctive red scarf quite deliberately, Miss Yates," Miss Marple observed. "If anyone saw a woman at Winter Road, they would remember the color but not necessarily the person. It was meant to be misdirection from the beginning. You led Mr. Pembroke to the meeting spot, engaging him in conversation about the financial arrangements, while Mr. Pierce approached from the rear. But something went wrong with your careful plan. Perhaps Mr. Pembroke was more suspicious than you expected, or perhaps your own nerves betrayed you." He realized the danger and turned to face his attacker. The defensive wounds on his hands show he fought back, which explains why there were two separate impacts. The initial blow from behind that you intended, Mr. Pierce, and then the fatal strike from the front when he confronted you. Miss Yates finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "He was going to destroy us all, not just the financial arrangements, but people's lives, their reputations. He had files on half the village, photographs, private letters. He called it insurance, but it was systematic extortion." "Indeed," Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "A desperate situation that led to desperate measures. But it was the aftermath that revealed the true extent of your involvement. The careful staging of the scene, placing the red wool in the hedge to suggest a woman's presence without pointing to anyone specific, the attempt to make it appear like a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. Poor Evans, in his well-meaning panic, disrupted your staging by wrongly buttoning the coat and moving the hat, but you adapted quickly. The safety deposit box in Oakbridge was your most significant error, Miss Yates. When Evans hid the envelope and key he found in Mr. Pembroke's pocket, you knew exactly where to look because you understood his methods, his hiding places. Your midnight visit to retrieve them, followed by your morning trip to the bank using your own initials, PY, created a trail that led directly back to you both. Dr. Haydock appeared quietly in the doorway, followed by Inspector Slack, whose expression carried a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal chagrin at having initially pursued the wrong suspect entirely. "The limestone samples in your motor car will match the dust in the wound, Mr. Pierce," Miss Marple said gently. "And the bank clerk's description of the woman in the red scarf will identify Miss Yates conclusively. The evidence is quite overwhelming, I'm afraid." Mr. Pierce finally spoke, his voice hollow with defeat. He was going to expose everything, not just the money, but the people we were trying to protect. The blackmail files contained information that would have destroyed innocent families, ruined lives for the sake of his greed. We thought we could frighten him into reason. But Harold Pembroke was beyond reason, Miss Yates added, her composure finally giving way to tears. He laughed when we threatened to go to the authorities. He said they'd find his files eventually, and everyone would suffer except him. He'd arranged it so that all the official blame would fall on others while he remained clean. Inspector Slack stepped forward with professional courtesy, tinged by obvious reluctance. "You'll both need to come with me," he said quietly. "The degrees of responsibility will be sorted out properly, but the evidence Miss Marple has presented leaves little room for doubt about the basic facts." As the arrests were made with the subdued efficiency that such moments required, Miss Marple reflected on how completely the case had transformed from its apparent simplicity. What had seemed like a straightforward crime of passion had revealed itself as something far more complex, a web of corruption and blackmail that had ultimately destroyed its architect as thoroughly as it had threatened its victims. Standing at Mrs. Bantry's window as the police motor cars departed, Miss Marple contemplated the eternal patterns of human nature that made such tragedies both shocking and inevitable. "People often believe that elaborate deceptions will protect them," she observed to her friend, "but it's usually the small human details that reveal the truth. A carefully mended scarf, clay and expensive shoe stitching, the particular way someone buttons a coat into panic. These things tell stories that no amount of planning can entirely conceal. The snow had begun to fall again, transforming St. Mary Mead back into its deceptive winter peace. But Miss Marple knew, as she had learned so many times before, that beneath the pristine surface, the deeper currents of human nature continued their eternal flow, sometimes gentle, sometimes turbulent, but always, ultimately, revealing their true direction to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand. The winter road would return to its quiet solitude, but it would carry forever the memory of how greed and desperation had transformed ordinary people into instruments of their own destruction, and how the gentle persistence of truth had finally brought their carefully constructed deceptions to light. The arrests of Miss Patricia Yates and Mr. Pierce brought to St. Mary Mead the particular quiet that follows the exposure of long-hidden secrets, though it was a silence pregnant with whispered conversations and carefully averted glances. Within hours, the news had spread through every cottage and shop, transforming the morning's shocking revelations into the sort of village legend that would be recounted for generations. Tom Fletcher's release that same evening was met with a mixture of relief and shame from those who had been so certain of his guilt, though the farmer himself bore no grudges, understanding that fear makes people grasp at simple explanations for complex tragedies. The weeks that followed revealed the true scope of Harold Pembroke's corruption through the methodical process of legal investigation. Miss Yates's confession, delivered with the same precise efficiency she had brought to her secretarial duties, laid bare a blackmail operation that had extended far beyond St. Mary Mead's borders. The hidden ledger proved to be merely the visible portion of a network involving shell companies, numbered accounts, and systematic extortion that had flourished under the respectable cover of municipal politics. Her trial, when it came, painted her not as a calculating killer, but as someone who had been systematically exploited before being driven to desperate measures. The judge's sentence of 12 years reflected both the gravity of her crime and the extraordinary circumstances that had led to it. Mr. Pierce faced harsher justice, as befitted the man who had struck the fatal blow. His 25-year sentence acknowledged that whatever noble motives he claimed about protecting innocent victims, he had ultimately chosen violence as his solution to a problem that might have been resolved through legal channels. The limestone dust found embedded in his gloves provided irrefutable evidence, while his own financial records revealed the extent of his involvement in the money laundering scheme that had used the development project as its cover. Dr. Haydock, making his regular visit to Miss Marple's cottage, brought news that provided satisfying closure to the case's most troubling aspects. The safety deposit box contained more than money, he reported, settling into his usual chair with obvious relief. Pembroke had written a detailed confession, apparently as insurance against his partners. Rather ironic that his own paranoia provided the evidence that exonerated several innocent people who might otherwise have faced charges. The development project collapsed entirely once the financial irregularities came to light, leaving the village common to return to its ancient peace. The aggressive green hoardings that had appeared overnight vanished just as quickly, and children resumed their games on land that would remain forever undisturbed by the ambitions of corrupt men. Evans the postman recovered his equilibrium, though he now approached official correspondence with exaggerated care and had developed the habit of checking his buttonwork twice before venturing into public. His testimony had proven crucial in establishing the timeline of events, and Inspector Slack had grudgingly admitted that the frightened man's interference with the crime scene had ultimately helped rather than hindered the investigation. Mrs. Bantry's gift of soup and ham, accompanied by a note about the humanity of nerves, had helped restore his confidence in the village's essential kindness. Miss Marple, observing these developments from her sitting-room window, reflected on how completely the case had transformed from its deceptive simplicity. What had appeared to be a straightforward crime of passion had revealed itself as the violent culmination of systematic corruption, though the human elements remained eternally familiar. The red scarf that had seemed so mysterious had proven to be exactly what careful observation suggested, a deliberate misdirection that ultimately led to truth rather than concealing it. The winter road gradually shed its grim associations, becoming once again merely another lane in the peaceful English countryside, though those who knew its story would forever detect the faint echo of that desperate morning when greed and desperation had collided with fatal consequences. The wrongly buttoned coat, the distinctive clay on expensive shoes, the careful repair work on fine wool. Each detail had contributed to a pattern that revealed not just the identity of the killers, but the complex web of circumstances that had driven ordinary people to extraordinary crime. As spring approached and the first daffodils pushed through the thawing earth, St. Mary Mead adapted to its changed circumstances with the resilience that small communities had, developed over centuries of surviving human folly. The village had been forever altered by its encounter with systematic corruption, yet life continued its ancient rhythms with a wisdom born of experience. Standing at her window as evening light faded over the restored common, Miss Marple contemplated the eternal patterns that made such tragedies both shocking and inevitable. People would always be tempted by easy money and the power that came from dangerous secrets, but they would also always be undone by the small, human details that no amount of planning could entirely conceal. Murder, she had learned long ago, possessed a remarkable ability to reveal the secret chambers of human nature, and truth, however long delayed, always found its way to the surface through the patient accumulation of careful observation. The case was closed, justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead could return to its deceptive tranquility, though those who looked closely would always see the deeper currents flowing beneath its peaceful surface.